Hey, good evening, friends. Nice to have you with us as we continue to study through this second book of Samuel. We're in our midweek study here in the Granite Bay Hilltop Seventh-day Adventist Church in the greater Sacramento area and Granite Bay. So nice to have all of you that are tuning in through Facebook and whatever other ways that we are streaming even right now, and for those of you who watch in the future. Always good to have our local members be able to join us now. It's kind of like a reunion in a large way. It's good to see some faces that are familiar, but I haven't seen for more than a couple of months. And so this pandemic has definitely taken its toll on our connections and relationships in different ways, but it is nice to be able to start to reconnect and not just talk to the camera only, as much as I am blessed to be able to talk to you that are watching here this evening, but also with some of my local friends here in our church family as well. So a special welcome to all those who are members of the Granite Bay Church, those who are friends of the Granite Bay Church that are with us here this evening. We pray that this study we'll be able to get something out of it. It's not a study that I can say, as almost went into routine and said, I'm excited to get into the Word and to study, and certainly God has put this chapter in 2 Samuel chapter 13 for us to learn a lesson from, to be able to understand the dynamics of sin and consequences and so on. But quite frankly, it's one of my least favorite chapters in the entire Bible. And if you haven't read it ahead of time, and maybe you've never read it in the past, you're going to very soon find out why I call it one of my least favorite chapters in the Bible. Well, with that being said, let's open with prayer, and we'll ask the Lord to be with us tonight. Father in heaven, we want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to study your word. We thank you for the opportunity to be able to learn lessons, some of them even as sober as they are in the chapter that we're looking at here tonight. I want to pray that you will do a work in upon our hearts, and that you will protect our hearts and our lives from some of these negative consequences that can come into our lives or to the lives of our families, our children, through some of the bad choices that sometimes we can be guilty of making as parents. And so, Lord, I want to pray that this will be a measure of prevention for those of us that haven't made these mistakes or and such as David and others have made. And Lord, that for those of us who are guilty, that you will help us to be able to learn the perseverance of leaning upon your mercy and grace, and that you do give us second chances, even though the road does become harder. And so, Lord, we thank you for listening in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, friends, it's kind of, like I said in our intro, it's kind of, in a large way, it's going from bad to worse. David has started a chain of events that are the result of his negligence on a number of different fronts. The first one was his faithfulness to his to the Lord, first and foremost, to his commandments, and also to his, in his case, back in that culture, in his marriage vows and wives. And he had decided to take the wife of another man, one of his most faithful soldiers and commanders and officers in the army, and then had his life taken. And of course, that's all review. We've looked at it in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But that has started a chain of events as God had prophesied and declared to David. So David learned 2 things. He heard 2 things from the Lord when Nathan the prophet had confronted him with the parable that revealed his guilt. And he said, first off, the sword is not going to leave your house. And remember, we have to remember that house is not only applied to a physical building that people live in, but it also applies to, we have to start learning how to react. We haven't responded with people in teaching for a year. But I'm just I'm engaging our people here as much as I can. So a house can mean either, in the Bible writer's mind, a house was defined either as a physical building that you lived in, or it also was defined as a family. Okay, so a house also was a term that they used towards your family. So you have the Paxton house, or you have the Brummund house, or you have, so you have these different houses that they would use that term for family, your lineage, your extended family. And so God said that your sword would not leave your house, and what you did in secret with a man's wife, another man will do it open before the sun with your wives. And then so he was learning some of the consequences, and also your firstborn son of the adulterous affair will die. And so there's some very real immediate consequences and long-term consequences. So even as God had said, your sins are forgiven you, you will not die, as David sincerely owned his sin, confessed his sin, repented of his sin, we find that God still said, listen, not only is there a personal lesson that you have to learn, and I have to let sin run its natural course to a large degree, but because of your responsibility and because of your great influence, I really have to even turn it up a couple of notches as well. Well, David, unfortunately, was not only guilty of that, but he was so wrapped up in all of his success that not only was he falling into temptation in regards to his sexual integrity, but then he was also neglecting his responsibility as a father, as a dad. And so because of that, his sons are starting to reveal characters that are not all that good. And so because they were self-indulgent, kind of left to their own, they have lots of riches, lots of resources, lots of servants, but just not a whole lot of guidance and correction. And now, of course, David doesn't really have a lot of moral influence with his sons because of what we've read in the last couple of 3 chapters. So it's not a good picture, is it? This is not a nice part of the Bible. It's not a nice part of history. And yet we're learning about a man that was after God's own heart, David. And so there's a couple of lessons there. Again, prevention. We can learn, as Paul says, these things are written for us for our admonition in order to instruct us and help us as a measure of prevention. That when we're tempted in the directions and make bad choices like David made, we can say, no, I remember how it worked out with David. I better not. I'm not going to sin against the Lord, nor go through what David brought upon himself and his family. So that's important, and then of course there is some lessons there also that if we're sincere and we persevere, we can still stay in the family of God, we can still stay in salvation, we can still be in the kingdom for eternity, but we have a harder road that we've set ahead of us. All right, so with that context kind of being said, let's go to chapter 13. We'll start to look at the actual verses. It starts with 3 key children of David's. We have Amnon, and as we come along here, we'll find out that, let's go ahead and read a couple of verses first. It says, after this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. And as we're going to find out, it was actually a half-sister. Verse 2 says, Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin, and it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her. So he's beside himself, and he's just kind of torturing himself, and he's obsessing over this sister in a very sinful way, rather than recognizing, hey, listen, this is where my thought processes are going, this is where my desires are going, but at the same time, I understand that God tells me that these things are wrong. The law of Moses very clearly tells me that these things are forbidden, and they're sinful, and there's good reason for that, and so I need to be able to shut that out. I need to fight against that rather than, make myself sick over it. So in other words, he's ruminating. Rather than push it back, rather than fight it, he's ruminating. In fact, he's ruminating to the point where he's kind of, it's not lovesick. We're going to find out very quickly through this chapter. He's not in love with her. He's in lust with her, but he's so obsessed in his lust over this cousin, as we're going to find out, this half sister, that not the cousin I should say, but half sister, that he's, as it says here, he was distressed over her and he became sick. In other words, she became kind of an idol. She was the center of his thoughts and desires continually, and he was beside himself because she wasn't available. All the circumstances said, no, this is forbidden, she's forbidden. And of course, intermarriage in relations that are too close in the family now is forbidden. We have that with Abraham and Sarah and some others, in the past, obviously with Adam and Eve and the first children. That's one of the common questions. Well, who did Adam and Eve's children marry? Well, it sounds kind of repulsive, or it certainly should sound sinful to us today, because God says it is sinful now. But back then, the DNA and the gene pool was so pure that it wasn't a problem. It wasn't seen as repulsive in the way that we rightly see it today. And so we find that at this point, by the time Moses came along, and of course Moses lived a few hundred years, like 500 years before this. And so, for over 500 years, God has forbidden marrying too close within your relative's family. And he's not really interested in marrying her. She's a virgin, waiting for, a godly and an honorable man to take her hand in marriage. And Amnon just wants to seduce her. That's all he's interested in. So verse 3, it says, "But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother." Now Jonadab was a very crafty man. And so there's another lesson learned for us. As Paul said in the New Testament, he says, "Do not be deceived, for bad company corrupts good habits." Now, if you haven't memorized that one and you haven't taken it to heart, it's a good one to take to heart right from the beginning of life. In other words, God says, do not be deceived. In other words, there's too many of us. Paul saw Christians that were thinking, it's okay for me to kind of cozy up and have close friends that have bad habits. Their morals and their values are not in line with God's and with myself. And somehow, we convince ourselves that, you know what, it'll eventually rub off on that person. I'll eventually change that person. And, well, no, the Bible says, do not be deceived. It says, bad company corrupts good habits. And so, choosing our company and choosing our friendship and our social circles is not a small thing, God says. And certainly we find here that Amnon was making a bad choice in becoming close friends with Jonadab. Now, Jonadab was the son of Shimeah, David's brother, so that would make him today what we would call a cousin, isn't he? So he's in the family, but that doesn't mean, and that's another lesson, having a cousin that's very crafty, that doesn't hold the values of God and of yourself, doesn't mean, just because they're family, doesn't mean that you have to be their friend. You have to cozy up to them and hang with them. No, not at all. So there's another good scriptural lesson for us, that Amnon was choosing bad friends. And that's what it's pointed out here. And he said to him, "Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner after day?" And so Amnon is so obsessed in his lust and his obsession over this half-sister that he's sick, and he's obviously his appetite is gone, and he's not eating enough, and so he's growing thinner physically, literally every day. And so Jonadab starts to flatter him, and he says, "Why are you the king's son?" Now, in other words, you're a prince. You're the son of the king. And look at yourself. It's pathetic. Will you not tell me? And Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar." Now, I don't know if Amnon shared it with him before or not. Doesn't say, but certainly, as far as his obsession. But now Amnon, he's confessing, certainly Amnon is confessing the source of his sickness and his lack of appetite. Loss of appetite. And so Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." And so we have to remember that Absalom and Tamar, we have to understand, I should say, that Tamar and Absalom come from the same mother. Amnon comes from a different mother. Same dad, which is David. Why? Because again, back then, in the culture, particularly with kings, it was not unusual to have more than a couple of wives. In fact, if we go back just a few chapters, we've already read in chapter 3, there's a list there. And in some of the verses there, verses 2, 3, and 4, and 5, it lists the six key wives of David. Now, of course, Bathsheba now is added to that. So now he has 7 key wives. So before Bathsheba, he had 6, now he has 7. But before Bathsheba came into the picture, there's a list here. And it turns out in verse 2 it says the firstborn was Amnon. So Amnon is the natural and assumed successor to the throne. After David dies, Amnon was the one that would have taken the throne. And so he's a key son, isn't he? He's the firstborn. He's not only the firstborn of that wife, but he's the firstborn of all the sons of David. But you'll notice here that all of these sons, including Absalom is the third oldest, and it goes through the different 6 wives and the firstborn sons of those 6 different mothers. And so David has 6 wives. Now with Bathsheba and Solomon, he has 7 wives, and he has 7 key firstborn sons. And again, the oldest is Amnon. So that helps give us some context there again as well. In verse 5, it says, back into 2 Samuel chapter 13, it says, so Jonadab said to him, lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. So Jonadab thinks that he's helping out his friend, and he's revealing that he's not a good choice for a friend for Absalom. Lie down in your bed and pretend to be ill, and when your father comes to see you, say to him, let my sister Tamar come and give me food and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand. Verse 6, it says, then Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill, and so obviously he bought into the plan. And then the king came to see him. Amnon said to the king, please let Tamar my sister come and make a couple of cakes for me in my sight, that I might eat from her hand. And David sent home to Tamar and said, now go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So David obviously is not privy to the plan at all. He has no idea what the scheming is behind all this, and so he only sees and assumes pure motives, and that this brother is only interested in the encouragement of Tamar, thinking, well, Tamar must be one of his favorite half-sisters, and so she would be a source of encouragement for him as he goes through this serious suffering of illness. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was lying down. And then she took flour and kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. And then she took the pan and placed them out before him, but he refused to eat it. And then Amnon said, have everyone go out from me, and they all went out from him. Now, of course, this reveals again that this is a royal scene. In our houses, if this half-sister came over, step-sister, it would just be you and maybe another brother or cousin or whatever's just hanging around the house. But, he sent everyone out. Everyone go out for me. And, of course, this is an array of servants. The royal family always has people dressing them and helping them clean them and feed them and all kinds of help that they get throughout the day that they use to their advantage. So he sends them all out. In verse 10 it says, then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the bedroom that I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the cakes which she had made and brought them to Amnon her brother in the bedroom. And so Amnon is working in a very sly way here. And not only is David oblivious to the devious plans and intentions, but obviously Tamar is also, assuming that there's good intentions and motivations from her half-brother Amnon. Now when she had brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, come, lie with me, my sister. And so he's coming out with his intentions, and he's saying, hey, listen, the bed's here, food, you're a woman, I'm a man, and I'm certainly attracted to you, and I'm hoping that you'll be attracted to me, and that you'll be just as interested in sleeping together as I am. But verse 12 says, she answered him, no, my brother, do not force me. No, do not do such, for no such thing should be done in Israel. So what was her perspective? Her perspective is, no, this is not right. This is a sinful and shameful thing that you're proposing to me. In verse 13, it says, "And I, where could I take my shame?" She says, "Listen, I'm going to be the one that's going to be out in the dark more than anybody. I'm going to be the one that suffers from this more than you or anyone else. And as for you, you would." Well, she does say, "As for you, you would be like one of the fools in Israel." And so she points out that, hey, listen, you won't have the shame that I'll carry, but certainly you will be like one of the fools in Israel. And fool would be what would you call it, a mild term for this man at this point, because, of course, he's more than a fool. He's a fool. He's a sinful fool. "Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." And I'm guessing that she's kind of speaking from desperation at this point, because she could see in his tone, in his mannerism, in his words, his actions, that he was intent on fulfilling his desires and purposes. And so she's trying to, it appears to me that she's trying to make the best and try to bring the best ending to this that she possibly can. And so she says, "Go and speak to the king, for he will not hold you from me, or withhold me from you." And so go and make arrangements with David, and I'm sure that he'll give me your hand in marriage. Let's do this right. Listen, if you're that intent, you desire me that much, let's do it right. And verse 14 goes on and says, "However, he would not heed her voice, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her." Now, what do we call that today? That's rape, isn't it? So the legal term for that is, or at least the street term for that is rape. Sexual assault, I think, is the legal term. So now you know why I wasn't looking forward to this chapter. "Then Amnon hated her exceedingly." It's only getting worse. Verse 15 is worse than verse 14. Verse 15, it says, "Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, 'Arise and be gone.'" And so she said to him, "No, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. She's saying, "Listen, it has gone from bad to worse." And so we have here the heart of Amnon is being revealed, that this is nothing but pure, unadulterated lust that has been driving him to this not love sickness, but lust sickness. And so his intentions are straight from the sinful heart and from the evil one. And so now that he has accomplished his purposes, he has gotten his desires, now his desire for her has disappeared completely. And of course, there's no love, there's no good intentions, there's no care at all for the life and the heart and the mind of this woman. It's just pure animal desire. And so he sends her away, and now she's so desperate. She's saying, "Listen, this is even worse than what, back in the law of Moses, if you commit adultery, it's either death, or if you seduce a woman that's out of, a virgin that's not wed, you were obligated to marry that woman." And so, she's looking for at least that. First she's begged him and tried to convince him, "Listen, go and talk to the king, go and talk to David, and if he sees how much you really want me, and then you can take my hand in marriage. Let's do this right." That failed, and now he takes her, and now he wants nothing to do with her and sends her away. Now we have to remember, this is bad enough in our culture, but back then it was even more exaggerated, or more exemplified, I guess is the word we can say, because a woman that loses her virginity and so on, this is something that's very frowned upon, and so her value and desire for an honorable woman, a godly man, and so on is diminished greatly. which is what she was pointing out in the beginning. Where am I going to go with? Where could I take my shame? And as we discover throughout the rest of the chapter here, that sure enough, there's no marriage in the future that's recorded here whatsoever, but rather she has to now reside with her brother Absalom. In verse 16 it says, so she said to him, no, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other, what you did. He would not listen to verse 17. Then he called his servant who attended him and said, here, put this woman out, away from me, and bolt the door behind her. So his servant has kind of come back into the scene again, into the room, and he gives him the command to help this woman forcefully have this woman exit out of his room and bolt the door behind her. Now she had on a robe of many colors, for the king's virgin daughters wore such apparel. So that was a sign of a princess. A virgin princess was one that would wear a more expensive robe, one that was of multi-colors, that required a lot more expensive handiwork and dye. We have to remember that when, cloth back then and clothing is so different back then compared to what it is today. Today we can go down and we can find clothes for free. We can go down to the Salvation Army, to a thrift shop and so on, and they'll give us, and if not, we'll have to pay a quarter for it or something. You can buy a t-shirt for a quarter. Just to give you an idea, this is the illustration of how expensive and how valuable cloth was and fabric was compared to clothing today. When Jesus was crucified on the cross, he had his outer tunic and then he had his inner tunic, and they took the inner tunic and they tore it into 4 sections. Today, if we did that, somebody's going to die and they take his t-shirt and rip it in 4 pieces, we'd look at you funny and say, well, I can use it for a rag, I guess, for my oil changes or something, but that's, it means nothing to us. But back then, just a torn quarter of a inner tunic was of great value. And the outside one was so valuable that, that it was, because it was without seam, they would, it says they gambled over it. They rolled dice over it to see who would take it home instead of tearing it. Clothes were a high commodity back then. And so to have it with all these different colors would take a lot more labor and a lot more resources and so on. So it was a very expensive and royal way of declaring that not only was she a princess, but also that she was a virgin that had not yet been wed. And his servant put her out and bolted the door behind her, it says in verse 18. Then Tamar put ash on her head and tore her robe of many colors that was on her. Now, of course, this is a symbol of 2 ways. This was an ancient a symbol of declaring of loss, of some great grievance if somebody died. When Jacob, remember we were reading in Genesis, and Jacob was told that his second youngest son Joseph was torn and killed by lions, and the son showed him this bloodied, colored, torn robe, of the multicolored robe of Joseph, and he tore his robe and he put ashes on his head. And this was an ancient sign of saying that they are grieving something very grievous, and loss that took place. Her virginity had been robbed from her against her own will. And so she tears this very expensive robe, declaring that she is in grief, but also declaring that she was no longer a virgin princess. She was as they would see it, a defiled princess. And so this was major, major stuff. Laid her hands on her head and went away crying bitterly. Her life was over in a large way in her heart and her life and in the culture of that day. Ashes were easy to find, of course, because back then they didn't have furnaces and forced airs and HVACs and everything. There's fires going all over the place, and so ashes were much more available and easy to find. So that wouldn't be much of a chore for her to find ashes nearby to be able to put on her head. And Absalom, it says in verse 20, and her brother said to her, has Amnon your brother been with you? But now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother's Absalom's house. And so the key word there is desolate. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Her life was ruined in a large way back in that culture. all to be able to just to satisfy one short, desirous, lustful moment. And by the way, does this sound familiar? I never really, it's really connecting, isn't it? Like father, like son. Yeah, so David was guilty of something very, very similar to this. And so she's desolate, and of course Absalom inquires, have you been with your brother? Now he says, has Amnon your brother been with you? That was an implication. That was saying, that today we would say, has your brother slept with you? This is a nice way of saying, did he have sexual relations with you? And of course the conversation is not played out in full because, of course, much of what is recorded here has to be kind of a comprehensive and concise kind of summary of what is taking place. And so now she has nowhere to go but to Absalom's house. And in a large way, she doesn't have much hope for finding a house and a future husband. Verse 22, it says, but when King David heard of all these things, he was what? He was angry, wasn't he? Yeah. So he was rightly angry because he just had one of his daughters raped by another, the son of one of his other wives, and so there's this horrible sin that has taken place within the family, and David is angry. He's mad about it. What else did David do besides get angry? Nothing. Nothing at all. Now, we can kind of understand that because David didn't have a lot of moral authority at this time, does he? It's hard for him to sit down and tell his son, listen, there's got to be some consequences. You've got to be imprisoned. You've got to be stripped of your royal name. The law says that your life should be taken. But David's living, and he was guilty of something very similar himself. It's very hard for David to sit down and say, listen, the law of Moses says that you should be stoned to death when he should be stoned as well. And so there's not a whole lot of moral authority there, and so King David gets angry, but that's all he does. And so the family, of course, is going to suffer because of that. And the influence on Israel is not good as well. Verse 22, it says, and Absalom spoke to his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad. And so Absalom says, listen, just try not to take it personally. Keep it to yourself. Hold your peace. Now, as the story unfolds here, he's not telling him, hold your peace because, listen, let's just not rock the boat. Let's not ruffle the feathers. Let's not ruffle the water. Let's not stir the waters up. Let's not make a big scene out of this. Let's just quietly, I'll just quietly take you in and I'll take care of you for the rest of your life. I'll provide for you as a husband would have, and so on. But rather instead, the story unfolds. We find that Absalom has a secret plan that is trapped up in here in his mind only. He doesn't even show that he shares it with her. But as he sees that his dad is not doing anything about it, he has his own plans in mind. But when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry, and Absalom spoke to his brother, neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. So there's some very real and rightful feelings, hard feelings towards him. In verse 23, it says, and it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, so Absalom invited all the king's sons. It was not unusual during sheep shearers' time when they kind of came to the end of it, or even during it, they would kind of make it into a bit of a feast and a festival and so on, because they were taking in a lot of profit at that time, because this is kind of where your sheep, the sheep's profits are about to come in, and so there's going to be an extra measure of money coming into the bank, and so they would kind of have a celebration and a feast. And then Absalom came to the king and said, kindly note your servant has sheep shears. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. But the king said to Absalom, "No, my son, let us not all go now. Let us we be a burden to you." And then he urged him that he would not go, and he blessed him. Now I have a feeling that Absalom knew that his dad was going to say no. That the kings don't have time to be able to go over and kind of celebrate with sheep shears, even if it's with his kids and so on. And so verse 26, then Absalom said, "If not, then please send my brother Amnon go with us." And the king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" Now this is a couple of years later, but somehow David isn't really catching on here, which I guess is really revealing more than anything how well Absalom was able to veil his hatred that was seething in his heart towards Amnon. Now, Absalom may not be as guilty as Amnon, but he's certainly still guilty here, isn't he? He's revealing a character that's not like Christ either, isn't he? Does God tell us that we should hold on to hatred? Should we let hatred kind of seethe and kind of nurture and grow in our hearts? No, not at all. So God tells us that we should never hate towards others. And yet we find here that, what does it say in the Sermon on the Mount? What does Jesus say? Love your neighbors, bless those who curse you. You have heard that it is said, love your enemy, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies. So even as Amnon might be an enemy of all that is right and all that Absalom sees as right, and rightfully so, he's still making the bad choice of choosing hate, of allowing that hatred to seethe and to grow, and rather than give it to the Lord, rather than confess it before him and say, listen, this is a horrible and terrible thing that this half-brother has done to my sister, but I'm only adding more sin to the pile. I'm only adding more garbage to the dump by allowing hatred to be able to rule my heart and to be able to scheme revenge in ways that God has not told me to do. And so there was a civil penalty, but that civil penalty was not being, and we have stories like that in our justice system. We have a pretty good justice system, one of the best in the world, but it's certainly not perfect, is it? And sadly, we have a lot of stories where justice just isn't met. Somebody is horribly wronged by one of our family members, might be horribly wronged in such a way as we're looking at here, and the criminal walks free. It's a court procedural. The police didn't quite follow the right protocol, and is thrown out of court, and that man walks free. And so the million-dollar question is, what we do with that? Where do we go with that? Well, Jesus says, and I know this is not easy. This goes against everything within our sinful instinct. But God still tells us we need to get on our knees and pray, God, please give me forgiveness and mercy towards this person. Even though I want to strangle him and I want that person dead and I have all these harsh feelings towards that person, please take it away and help me to know that you're going to be able to, revenge is mine, says the Lord. But rather than giving the revenge to the Lord, he's taken it upon himself. Now, when you look at the spirit of prophecy in the prophets and kings, or patriarchs and prophets, Ellen White does point out that there's a dynamic here that God will use sometimes. Because David didn't bring justice, God did allow and permit the evil one to influence and to motivate and bring Absalom into the scheme that justice would be done upon Amnon in such a way that David should have actually overseen as a civil issue, because David is a civil leader. Yes, he's a priest, he's a king, he's a prophet, but he's also a civil leader, isn't he? And so his civil responsibility was to hold Amnon responsible for his crime, which he didn't. And so just like God used Babylon to punish and to discipline Israel, it's not because Babylon was a good person, it was a good friend of God. Nebuchadnezzar at first when he came into Jerusalem, he wasn't a saint, he wasn't a friend of God in any means. But God was still using him. So God is using Absalom, even though Absalom is doing and making some bad choices himself and giving himself over to the influence of the evil one. But God is using that to accomplish his purpose in bringing justice upon Amnon in a way that David and the civil system didn't. And so we return back to chapter 12 and we look at a key verse. I'm sorry. My apologies. I keep getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to chapter 13 where we were, and then we'll go back to chapter 12. How about that? So where were we, what verse were we in? (27) But Absalom urged him, so he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. So now all the sons are going. But Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, watch now when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, and then kill him. Do not be afraid, for I have commanded you. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant. You say, listen, don't hesitate, don't feel guilty. This is a prince of the palace. This is a prince of the royal family telling you, when I say strike, strike him down. When he's vulnerable, when he's drunk, wine that he shouldn't be partaking of in the first place. After all, it does say at the end of Proverbs, when we go to the end of Proverbs, it tells us that in verse 4, it says, for it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink, it says in verse 4 in Proverbs 31. And so here we have another counsel that God gives that Absalom and certainly Amnon for certain is departing from. They're partaking of alcoholic wine in a way that God has forbidden in his word. And so Amnon's heart is merry, and he says, strike, and do not hesitate. In verse 29, so the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each one got on his mule and fled. There's panic, there's pandemonium, there's chaos. This brother has hired these servants to come in and kill one of their own brothers right in front of their own eyes. And so the king's sons are caught by surprise. Doesn't sound like they're, well, I guess it's a family affair, so they're not going to pick up a sword and start trying to kill Absalom right away. I can't tell you all the motives. But then in verse 30 it says, and it came to pass while they were on the way that news came to David, saying, Absalom has killed all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. And so the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the ground. Remember, that's what Tamar did when she was raped. So the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the ground, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn. And so here we have the king responding with grief, and he tears his garments, he lays on the ground, and his servants do the same thing. They're also caught up in the emotion, and they're closely associated with the family of David. They spent, many of them, years serving and living and eating and having these relationships with these people. And so this tragedy is affecting them in a very real way as well. And then Jonadab, the son of Shemiah, David's brother, answered and said, let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead. For by the command of Absalom this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. And so Jonadab, of course, is this crafty, immoral cousin that Amnon was friends with, and he's in on Absalom's conspiracy, obviously, as well. And so Absalom obviously has been confiding in this man Jonadab, or Jonadab has been kind of pulling it out of him, because he seems to be in the know of exactly what was going on and what Absalom has been kind of scheming for some time now. Now therefore, let not my lord the king take the thing to his heart and think that the king's sons are all dead, for only Amnon is dead. Well, certainly the bad news has become a little bit better, but it's certainly very tragic still, because one of his firstborn son is now dead. And now we can go back to chapter 12. And let's go back to chapter 12 and read verse 9. In 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 9 it says, why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword, You have taken his wife to be with you and have killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house. And again, he's talking about not just the building, it's more specifically his family. Why? Because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. And therefore I will raise up adversity against you from your own house. And he goes on to explain what Absalom now is going to commit. And God prophesies what Absalom is going to sin against David and against the Lord in the future here. So Absalom is no saint. Certainly we can sympathize him with as far as his feelings goes, but we can't sympathize with what he did with those feelings. We should actually be learning what not to do in regards to this. Then Absalom fled, and the young man who was keeping watch lifted his eyes and looked, and there many people were coming from the road on the hillside behind him. And Jonadab said to the king, "Look, the king's sons are coming, as your servant said, so it is." And so Absalom, then Absalom is flying in one direction. Absalom is fleeing in one direction, and all the king's sons are fleeing back to Jerusalem and back to the palace. And one of the servants and the lookouts are alerting them, and Jonadab brings the word to the king. And so it was, as soon as he had finished speaking, that the king's sons indeed came, and they lifted up their voice and wept. Also the king and all his servants wept bitterly. And so there's great weeping here because Amnon is dead, the firstborn. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. And so David didn't just mourn that day, but it was several days. It was days of mourning. In verse 38 it says, "So Amnon fled and went to Geshur and was there for 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon, because he was dead." Now, all our clocks are down here tonight, and my phone is on the front desk, on the front row here of seats. Does anybody have the time? 7:47. Okay, so we'll wrap it up there then. We're 3 minutes from our kind of target time to be able to wrap things up before we get into local prayer here and such. So, friends, again, like I said at the beginning, I wish this was a chapter that didn't exist. Certainly David wished it didn't exist, and he didn't have to live through all this. And not only David, but the rest of his family. It just goes to show again that, when we choose adultery and in the way that David had chosen, that it has a ripple effect that, especially when you go to the extent that he did to be able to cover it up, even to the point of murder, it has a ripple effect, and there's pains and effects that will last for the rest of the lives of the family. Scars that the family will carry and such. And so again, I hope that this will be like the Bible says, like Paul wrote in the New Testament, these things were written for our admonition, for our instruction, for us to be able to learn from as a measure of prevention. And so I hope that will help us to be able to stay on the narrow path and recognize those temptations, and recognize our desires that are in harmony with God, and be able to find the help and the time on our knees that we need to be able to leave those things behind or to avoid them altogether. All right, friends, so it's nice to have you join us here this evening. For those of you who are watching online, we're going to sign off there, and we wish you a blessed rest of the week. We look forward to having you again on Sabbath morning, 10 o'clock for Sabbath School Study Hour, and then, of course, our main worship service at 11 o'clock right here in the Granite Bay Hilltop Seventh-day Adventist Church. Until then, God bless you.